The city was burning. Billowing clouds of black smoke choked the air as flames consumed everything in their path. In the midst of the chaos, a lone figure sprinted down the crumbling streets, desperate to escape the nightmare that had consumed his world. This was Jack, a former soldier now thrust into a battle for survival against an enemy unlike anything he had ever faced. As he ran, the deafening sounds of chaos surrounded him, the distant wail of sirens, the agonized screams of the dying, and the haunting moans of the creatures that had once been human. Turning a corner, Jack collided with a group of survivors, their faces etched with terror. "They're everywhere," one of them cried. "We have to get out of the city." Without a moment's hesitation, Jack ushered the group forward, his eyes scanning the environment for any sign of the nightmarish beings that pursued them. The air was thick with the stench of death, and Jack could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he navigated the treacherous urban landscape. Suddenly, a blood-curdling shriek shattered the eerie silence, and Jack's heart raced as he caught a glimpse of their pursuers, the zombies, their bodies contorted and their eyes burning with a primal hunger. These were no ordinary undead. They moved with unnatural speed and agility, their mutations seemingly endless. "Keep moving," Jack yelled, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of destruction. The group surged forward, their footsteps echoing against the crumbling walls as they desperately sought a way out of the city. As they rounded a corner, they were met with a horrifying sight. A horde of zombies, their numbers stretching as far as the eye could see. Jack's mind raced, searching for a way to escape the seemingly inescapable trap. In a split-second decision, he ushered the group into a nearby building, barricading the entrance with whatever they could find. Inside, the survivors huddled in the darkness, their hearts pounding as the sounds of the zombies outside grew ever closer. Jack could feel the weight of their collective fear, the uncertainty of their fate hanging heavy in the air. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the building, and Jack knew their respite was short-lived. The zombies had found a way in, their unearthly howls filling the air as they swarmed the survivors. Jack gripped his makeshift weapon, his knuckles white with tension. He knew that this was no longer a battle he could win with his bare hands. The zombies had become too powerful, too relentless. As the creatures closed in, he steeled himself for the fight of his life, determined to protect the innocent lives that had been entrusted to him. In the chaos, Jack caught a glimpse of a possible escape route, a fire escape leading to the roof. "This way," he yelled, ushering the group towards the exit. They scrambled up the rickety stairs, the zombies in hot pursuit, their unearthly cries echoing through the building. As they burst out onto the rooftop, Jack felt a glimmer of hope, until he saw the true scale of the devastation. The city was engulfed in flames, the horizon dotted with plumes of black smoke. And in the distance, Jack could see the hordes of zombies, their numbers seemingly endless. The survivors huddled together, their faces etched with terror. Jack knew that they were facing a nightmare of unimaginable proportions, one that would test the limits of their will to survive. But as he steeled himself for the battle ahead, he couldn't help but wonder, would any of them make it out of this alive? Trapped on the rooftop, the small group of survivors huddled together, their eyes darting from one direction to the next as the horde of zombies closed in. Jack knew they had to act fast, but the sheer scale of the undead army threatening to consume them was overwhelming. "We have to find a way off this roof," he said, his voice tense with urgency. "Those things won't stop until they've torn us apart." The others nodded, their faces etched with fear and resignation. They scanned the rooftop, searching for any means of escape, but the options were painfully limited. The only way down was the fire escape they had just ascended, and that was now swarming with the ravenous creatures. Suddenly, one of the survivors, a young woman named Sarah, let out a gasp. "Look," she cried, pointing to the edge of the roof. "There's a helicopter." Jack followed her gaze and felt a glimmer of hope. Sure enough, a sleek, military-grade helicopter hovered nearby, its rotors whirring loudly. But even as the group surged towards it, they could see that it was already occupied. A lone figure stood inside the open doorway, waving them forward. Clutching their makeshift weapons, the survivors sprinted across the rooftop, their hearts pounding as the zombies gave chase. The creatures moved with unnatural speed, their twisted, mutated forms closing the distance with each passing second. As they neared the helicopter, the figure inside began to shout, urging them to hurry. Jack could see the desperation in the person's eyes, and he knew they had to make it. Failure was not an option. With a final, desperate burst of speed, the group reached the helicopter's open door. Jack ushered the others inside, his gaze sweeping the horde of zombies that swarmed the rooftop. "Get us out of here," he yelled to the pilot, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the rotors. The helicopter lurched into the air, and Jack felt the surge of relief as they left the zombie-infested city behind. But as he turned to survey the other survivors, he could see the fear and uncertainty etched on their faces. "Who are you?" one of them asked, his eyes fixed on the pilot. The figure turned, and Jack felt a chill run down his spine. It was a woman, her face tense with determination. "My name is Samantha," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm the only one who can get us out of this nightmare alive." As the helicopter soared over the devastated city, Jack knew that their ordeal was far from over. The zombies had proven to be a relentless and unpredictable enemy, and he could feel the weight of their uncertain future pressing down on him. But with Samantha at the helm, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Hope that they might just survive this apocalyptic nightmare. As the helicopter gained altitude, the small group of survivors huddled together, their eyes fixed on the inferno below. Jack could feel the weight of their collective fear and uncertainty, the sense that they had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. But even as they fled the zombie-infested city, Jack couldn't help but wonder about the enigmatic woman who had come to their rescue. Samantha, the helicopter pilot, sat at the controls, her expression unreadable. "Who are you?" one of the survivors, a middle-aged man named Mark, asked. "How did you know we were up there?" Samantha's gaze remained focused on the horizon, but Jack could see a flicker of tension in her shoulders. "I've been monitoring the situation in the city," she said, her voice calm and measured. "When I saw the horde closing in, I knew I had to act." Jack leaned forward, his brow furrowed with suspicion. "That doesn't answer the question," he said, his tone sharp. "How did you know where to find us?" Samantha hesitated, her grip tightening on the controls. I have my ways," she said, her voice faltering slightly. The survivors exchanged uneasy glances, and Jack could feel the tension in the air thickening. "What else are you hiding from us?" he pressed, his eyes narrowing. Samantha's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Jack thought she might refuse to answer. But then, with a heavy sigh, she spoke again. "I'm not just a pilot," she said, her gaze flickering to the rearview mirror. "I'm part of a specialized military unit, one that's been training for this kind of scenario for years." The survivors fell silent, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. Jack leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. "So, you knew this was coming?" he asked, his voice tinged with accusation. Samantha nodded, her eyes clouded with a mixture of regret and determination. "We've been monitoring the spread of the virus for months," she said, her voice low. "But we couldn't have predicted the scale of the outbreak, or the mutations." Jack felt a chill run down his spine as she spoke, the implications of her words sinking in. "So, you're saying these things aren't just zombies," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Samantha nodded grimly. "There's something else entirely," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "And they're only going to get worse." The survivors fell silent, the weight of Samantha's revelation settling over them like a heavy shroud. Jack could see the fear and uncertainty in their eyes, the realization that they were facing an enemy unlike anything they had ever encountered. As the helicopter soared on, Jack couldn't help but wonder what other secrets Samantha was hiding, and whether they would be enough to help them survive the nightmare that was unfolding before them. One thing was certain: the battle for their lives had only just begun. The helicopter soared over the devastated city. The survivors huddled in tense silence as Samantha guided the aircraft towards an unknown destination. Jack's mind raced, his thoughts consumed by the revelations Samantha had shared and the implications they held for their future. "Where are we going?" Sarah, the young woman who had first spotted the helicopter, asked tentatively. Samantha's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, her expression unreadable. "To a refuge," she said, her voice measured. "A secure military base that's been fortified against the outbreak." Jack leaned forward, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "And what makes you think it's still safe?" he asked, his tone laced with skepticism. Samantha's grip tightened on the controls, her knuckles white with tension. "Because I helped establish it," she said, her voice low. "It's our best chance at survival." The survivors exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Samantha's words hanging heavy in the air. Jack could feel the fear and uncertainty radiating from the group, their fragile hope teetering on the edge of collapse. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the helicopter, and the aircraft lurched to the side. Samantha's eyes widened, her face etched with alarm. "We've been hit," she yelled, her fingers dancing across the controls. Jack gripped the seat, his heart pounding as the helicopter began to descend. "What's happening?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "The zombies," Samantha said, her voice tense. "They're adapting. They've found a way to strike at us from the ground." As the helicopter neared the ground, Jack could see the horde of mutated creatures below, their twisted bodies surging towards the stricken aircraft. Samantha struggled to maintain control, her brow furrowed with concentration. "Brace yourselves," she yelled, just as the helicopter crash-landed in a cloud of dust and debris. The survivors tumbled from the wreckage, coughing and disoriented. Jack frantically scanned the area, his heart racing as he saw the zombies closing in. "This way," Samantha shouted, ushering the group towards a heavily fortified compound in the distance. "The refuge is just ahead." The survivors ran, their legs burning with the effort, as the zombies gave chase. Jack could feel the ground shaking beneath his feet, the creatures' unearthly roars echoing all around them. As they reached the compound's massive steel gates, Samantha frantically waved to the guards, her voice carrying across the open expanse. "Open up. We've got survivors." The gates groaned open, and the group surged inside, gasping for breath. Jack watched in horror as the zombies slammed against the barriers, their clawed hands clawing at the metal in a frenzied attempt to reach them. Once safely inside, the survivors collapsed, their bodies shaking with the adrenaline of their narrow escape. Jack turned to Samantha, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and suspicion. "All right," he said, his voice hoarse. "We made it. Now, what's the plan?" Samantha's expression hardened, her gaze sweeping over the group. "The plan is to survive," she said, her voice grave. "Because out there, the nightmare is only just beginning." The survivors huddled inside the heavily fortified compound, their eyes darting nervously as they surveyed their new surroundings. The air was thick with tension, the weight of their harrowing escape and Samantha's ominous warnings weighing heavily on their minds. Jack approached Samantha, his brow furrowed with a mix of curiosity and concern. "All right, we're here," he said, his voice low. "Now, what's the next move?" Samantha's expression was grim, her gaze fixed on the imposing steel gates that guarded the refuge. "We need to fortify this place," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "The zombies are evolving, and they're not going to stop until they've broken through." The other survivors gathered around, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and determination. "What can we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Samantha's eyes swept over the group, her mind clearly racing with a plan of action. "First, we need to gather supplies. Food, water, weapons, anything we can use to defend ourselves," she said, her tone authoritative. Then we need to reinforce the barriers, set up perimeter patrols, and establish a system of communication and coordination. Jack nodded, his mind already whirring with strategies and contingencies. All right, let's get to work, he said, his voice carrying a newfound sense of purpose. We don't have much time. The survivors sprang into action, their movements efficient and focused. Some headed out to scavenge for supplies, while others began the arduous task of reinforcing the compound's defenses. Samantha oversaw the entire operation, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of the impending zombie horde. As the hours ticked by, the compound slowly transformed into a fortified bastion of survival. Sandbags were stacked, barricades were erected, and a network of surveillance cameras and communication systems was established. But even as they worked, the survivors couldn't shake the ominous feeling that their preparations were just a temporary respite, that the true test of their resilience was yet to come. Jack approached Samantha, his expression grim. "Do you really think we can hold out against them?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Samantha's gaze hardened, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to try. We're all that's left." The weight of her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the dire circumstances they now faced. Jack knew that their survival was far from guaranteed, that the zombies had already proven to be an unpredictable and relentless enemy. But as he looked around at the determined faces of his fellow survivors, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had come this far, against all odds, and he knew that they would do whatever it took to protect this fragile sanctuary they had created. The final line of defense had been drawn, and the stage was set for a battle that would determine the fate of them all. The compound had been transformed into a fortress, its defenses reinforced with a patchwork of scavenged materials and grim determination. Jack, along with the other survivors, patrolled the perimeter, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. Samantha, ever the vigilant commander, stood at the center of the compound, her gaze fixed on the surveillance monitors that tracked the movements of the zombies. Her brow was furrowed with concentration, her mind racing with contingency plans and tactical maneuvers. Suddenly, a loud alarm blared, shattering the tense silence that had fallen over the refuge. Jack whirled around, his heart pounding, as Samantha's voice rang out over the speakers. "They're here," she said, her voice tense but unwavering. "All units, take your positions. This is it." The survivors scrambled to their posts, their fingers gripping their makeshift weapons with white-knuckled intensity. Jack could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he peered out over the fortified walls, his eyes searching the darkness for any sign of the enemy. And then he saw them, a vast, undulating horde of mutated creatures, their bodies contorted and their eyes burning with an unholy hunger. The ground trembled beneath their relentless advance, their unearthly moans echoing across the barren landscape. "Open fire!" Samantha's voice rang out, and the survivors unleashed a barrage of gunfire and improvised explosives. The air was thick with the stench of acrid smoke and the agonized screams of the zombies, but still, they pressed forward, their numbers seemingly endless. Jack gritted his teeth, his finger tightening on the trigger as he fired round after round into the seething mass of flesh and bone. But for every zombie that fell, two more seemed to take its place, their mutations rendering them ever more resilient and deadly. Samantha's voice crackled over the radio, her words laced with desperation. "They're breaching the outer perimeter. Fall back to the inner compound, now." The survivors fell back, their retreat a desperate scramble as the zombies surged forward, their clawed hands grasping at their heels. Jack could feel the weight of his weapon in his hands, the only thing standing between him and the nightmare that threatened to engulf them all. As they reached the inner compound, Jack turned to Samantha, his eyes wild with fear and determination. "What now?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of destruction. Samantha's expression was grim, her eyes filled with a grim resolve. We hold the line, she said, her voice steady. We fight until we can't fight anymore. The survivors braced themselves, their backs to the wall, as the horde of zombies crashed against the fortified barriers. Jack could feel the structure trembling beneath the onslaught, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before their defenses crumbled. But even as the nightmare closed in around them, Jack felt a spark of defiance ignite within his chest. They had come too far to surrender, and he'd be damned if he was going to let these twisted monstrosities take everything from him. With a roar of determination, he leveled his weapon and opened fire, his comrades at his side, united in their desperate struggle for survival. The compound was under siege, the fortified walls shuddering under the relentless assault of the zombie horde. Jack and the other survivors fought with everything they had, their weapons blazing as they desperately tried to hold back the tide of mutated creatures. Samantha, her face etched with grim determination, barked orders over the radio, her eyes constantly scanning the surveillance feeds for any sign of weakness in their defenses. She knew that they were fighting a losing battle, but she was damned if she was going to go down without a fight. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and the agonized screams of the undead, and Jack felt his heart pounding in his chest as he reloaded his weapon, his fingers trembling with exhaustion. Suddenly, a deafening explosion rocked the compound, and Jack whirled around to see a massive breach in the outer wall. The zombies poured through the gap, their twisted bodies surging forward with a ravenous hunger. Fall back. Samantha's voice rang out, her tone laced with panic. Regroup at the inner compound. The survivors scrambled to obey, their retreat a frantic dance of gunfire and desperate evasion. Jack could feel a breath catching in his throat as he ran, the sounds of the zombies' unearthly cries echoing all around him. As they reached the inner compound, Jack turned to Samantha, his eyes wild with fear and desperation. "What now?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the din of the battle. Samantha's expression was grim, her eyes filled with a mixture of resignation and defiance. "We hold this position," she said, her voice steady. "We fight until the end." The survivors took their positions, their weapons at the ready as the zombie horde closed in. Jack could feel the sweat beading on his brow, his muscles aching from the strain of the relentless combat. Suddenly, a massive, mutated creature burst through the crowd, its hulking form casting a menacing shadow over the compound. Jack's eyes widened in horror as he recognized the twisted visage of what had once been a human being. "Shoot it!" Samantha cried, her voice piercing through the chaos. "Aim for the head." The survivors opened fire, their bullets pounding against the creature's armored hide. But it refused to fall, its massive claws swiping through the air with devastating force. Jack felt his heart racing as he watched the battle unfold, his mind reeling with the realization that they were facing an enemy unlike anything they had ever encountered. These weren't just mindless zombies, they were intelligent, adaptable creatures, their mutations transforming them into true abominations. As the creature closed in, Jack knew that their last stand was upon them. He gripped his weapon tighter, his finger tightening on the trigger as he braced himself for the final onslaught. But then, just as the creature was about to strike, a series of deafening explosions rocked the compound, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Jack whirled around, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw a squadron of heavily armed soldiers storming the inner compound, their weapons blazing. "Get down!" One of the soldiers shouted, and the survivors scrambled for cover as a hail of gunfire rained down on the zombie horde. Jack could hardly believe his eyes as he watched the tide of the battle turn, the soldiers' superior firepower and tactics decimating the mutated creatures. Samantha stood beside him, her expression a mix of relief and astonishment. "Who are they?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with awe. Samantha's lips curved into a small, triumphant smile. "Reinforcements," she said, her voice filled with a newfound hope. "We're not alone in this fight." As the battle raged on, Jack felt a glimmer of hope ignite within his heart. They had survived the onslaught, and with these new allies at their side, Perhaps they had a chance of emerging from this nightmare alive. The compound echoed with the deafening sound of gunfire as the heavily armed soldiers fought to push back the relentless zombie horde. Jack and the other survivors huddled in the relative safety of the inner compound, their hearts pounding with a mix of relief and trepidation. Samantha stood beside them, her gaze fixed on the unfolding battle, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. "They came," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "But at what cost?" As the dust settled and the last of the zombies fell, Jack could see the grim faces of the soldiers as they surveyed the devastation. The compound's defenses had been shattered, the once fortified walls now reduced to rubble. One of the soldiers, a grizzled veteran with a stern demeanor, approached Samantha, his eyes filled with a heavy burden. "Ma'am, we've secured the compound, but the losses were heavy." Samantha's expression darkened, and Jack could see the weight of the news bearing down on her. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite the evident strain. The soldier shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Too many. This outbreak has spread farther than we ever imagined, and the mutations, they're unlike anything we've seen before." Jack felt a chill run down his spine as he listened to the exchange, the gravity of their situation becoming all too clear. These were not just mindless undead. They were an adaptive, intelligent threat that had pushed the military's finest to their limits. Samantha turned to the group of survivors, her expression solemn. "We've won this battle, but the war is far from over," she said, her voice laden with a sense of grim determination. "The refuge is no longer safe, and we need to move out. There's a safe zone, a last stronghold, but it's going to be a dangerous journey." The survivors exchanged uneasy glances, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resignation. They had come this far, survived the onslaught of the zombie horde, only to be faced with the prospect of another perilous journey. But as Jack looked around at the faces of his fellow survivors, he saw a glimmer of hope in their eyes. They had endured the unimaginable, and they were still standing. Whatever lay ahead, they were ready to face it head-on, united in their resolve to survive. Samantha turned to the soldiers, her expression hardening. "Prepare the vehicles," she said, her voice brooking no argument. "We leave in 1 hour. This refuge is no longer safe." As the survivors gathered their meager belongings and the soldiers began the grim task of securing the compound, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The victory they had won had come at a terrible cost, and he knew that the road ahead would be even more perilous. But even in the face of such overwhelming odds, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived this far, and with Samantha's guidance and the military's support, perhaps they had a chance of reaching that final stronghold and finding a way to put an end to the nightmare that had consumed their world. With a deep breath, Jack steeled himself for the journey ahead, his grip tightening on his weapon as he prepared to face the next chapter of this apocalyptic battle for survival.